Beneath the marble beauty of Monticello, the proud mountaintop home of Thomas Jefferson, there's a room no one ever talks about. It's not on the tours. It's not in the blueprints. For nearly 40 years, that small, hidden space kept a secret so dark that 3 American presidents, dozens of congressmen, and an entire political dynasty fought to erase it from history. But tonight, we're opening that door. If you love stories that history tried to hide, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, especially if you're in Virginia. Because what happened on that little mountain changed America forever, and not in the way your history books said it did. Part 1. The Secret Beneath the Mountain. Monticello, Virginia, 1773. The land was beautiful, rolling green hills, golden sunlight, and tobacco fields stretching as far as the eye could see. But beneath that beauty lay something cruel. The wealth of Virginia was built on invisible backs, on people whose names never appeared in Jefferson's letters or speeches. Thomas Jefferson was only 30 when he brought his new bride, Martha, to his grand experiment, a mansion he called Monticello, meaning Little Mountain, in Italian. It was more than a home to him. It was a dream, a stage for his genius. Every brick, every column, every secret staircase reflected his obsession with control. He designed dumbwaiters so wine could rise from the cellar without a servant's face ever being seen. He built hidden corridors so enslaved people could move through the house like ghosts, unseen by guests. To the world, it was a masterpiece, a symbol of democracy and enlightenment. But inside, it was a world of shadows, where silence was survival. Martha Jefferson brought with her more than fine dresses and charm. She brought land, money, and 40 enslaved people from her father's estate. Among them was a 14-year-old girl named Sarah, though everyone called her Sally. She was light-skinned, quiet, and observant. No one in polite Virginia society spoke of it aloud, but Sally Hemings was Martha Jefferson's half-sister. Her father, John Wales, had children by both his white wife and by an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings. That made Sally not just a servant, but family, blood-bound and enslaved. The Hemings family had a special place at Monticello. They weren't field laborers. They were trained house servants, cooks, musicians, and artisans. They could read, play music, and speak French. They understood the rhythms of the wealthy, the quiet, precise dance of serving without being seen. To visitors, they seemed fortunate compared to others. But they were still property. They could be bought, sold, or punished at a master's whim. And in the eyes of the law, they had no right to refuse anything their owner demanded. In those first years, Sally was just another girl in the background of Jefferson's grand experiment. She dressed Martha. She helped raise the Jefferson children. She saw the finest guests of Virginia dine in candlelight, talking about liberty, rights, and justice, all while she poured their wine. Martha's health declined quickly. Pregnancy after pregnancy drained her strength. Each year, she grew paler, weaker, and quieter. Jefferson was devoted to her, but when she died, something inside him broke. He vanished into his work, letters, books, blueprints, anything that could distract him from grief. The house reflected his mind. Rooms remained half-finished. Plans changed. Walls were torn down and rebuilt. There were spaces that seemed to appear and disappear depending on the year. Among them was one small, narrow room, 14 feet by 12, built beneath the main floor, tucked beside the wine cellar, with one small window facing the servants' quarters. That room would become the center of Monticello's darkest secret. But before that, Jefferson had a nation to build. After Martha's death, he threw himself into politics, governor of Virginia, diplomat to France, secretary of state. In Paris, he sent for one of the Hemings boys to train as a chef. Later, he would send for Sally. She was 16 when she crossed the Atlantic to serve in Jefferson's European household. In Paris, something shifted. For the first time, Sally lived in a country where slavery was illegal. If she chose to stay, she could have been free. But when Jefferson prepared to return to America, she agreed to go with him, on one condition. He promised her that her future children would be born free. She was already carrying his child. Back at Monticello, life went on. Visitors saw Jefferson's grand home, his inventions, his library, his gardens. They saw the proud author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who wrote that, all men are created equal. What they didn't see was the secret door leading to a room that didn't exist on any plans. They didn't hear the quiet cries of newborns whose lives were erased from records before they began. Between 1773 and 1809, at least 6 children were born in that hidden space, children who carried Jefferson's blood, yet were raised as slaves on his land. Some were light enough to pass for white. Others worked in the same rooms their father designed. Jefferson kept meticulous records, of weather, crops, expenses, but never of them. He knew exactly what he was doing. His farm journals even listed enslaved women as breeding value, calculating their children as profit. 4% annual return. He wrote that number as easily as he wrote about liberty. Albemarle County understood the hypocrisy. Every plantation did the same. They all spoke of freedom while building their lives on bondage. They all crafted lies to keep their conscience clean. But Jefferson's lie was grander, more fragile, and far more dangerous. Because his words, his ideals, were supposed to define a nation. If the world ever discovered the truth beneath Monticello, that the man who preached liberty had turned his own sister-in-law into a ghost in his cellar, everything he built could crumble. And so the cover-up began. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a war against memory. Letters destroyed, diaries edited, testimonies silenced. Even Jefferson's own grandchildren would grow up telling different stories, each version carefully shaped to protect his name. But history doesn't stay buried forever. Because in that secret room, in the walls of that mountain home, the ghosts of Monticello are still whispering. And what they have to say is only the beginning. To be continued in Part 2, The Paris Promise. Call to action. If you want to know what really happened between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, how power, love, and betrayal built America's greatest lie, don't miss Part 2. Subscribe, share this story, and comment where you're watching from. Because the truth we uncover next will change how you see history forever. Title: The Paris Promise, Part 2, The Ghost of Monticello. Hook. Imagine discovering that you are free, truly free, only to realize that your freedom is the one thing your master cannot allow. That's the impossible choice Sally Hemings faced in 1787. A young woman, enslaved since birth, standing in the glittering streets of Paris with a secret that could destroy one of America's founding fathers. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the US, especially from Virginia, tell me your city in the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because this story, the one they never taught in school, only gets darker from here. Part 2. The Paris Promise. This is the world into which Sally Hemings vanished, not through any scandal or disappearance, but through something far quieter. History simply refused to see her. Women like Sally, women who looked like her, were never meant to exist in the records of the powerful. It began on September 6, 1782. Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's beloved wife, died 4 months after giving birth to her 6th child. Only 3 of those children survived. The official reason was complications from childbirth, but everyone at Monticello knew the truth. Her health had been fading for years, her body breaking under the weight of pregnancies and grief. Jefferson's heartbreak was legendary. For weeks he wandered the halls of Monticello like a ghost himself, silent, sleepless, broken. He locked himself in his study, then burned every letter his wife had ever written to him. He wanted her memory, her pain, erased from the world. Before Martha died, she made him promise something that would shape the rest of his life. She asked him never to remarry. She couldn't bear the thought of another woman raising her children. Jefferson swore he never would. And he kept that promise for 44 years. But promises, like walls, can hide secret rooms. After Martha's death, the house fell into chaos. The master of Monticello drowned himself in politics, leaving the management of his home to others. The children were raised by relatives, and the enslaved workers kept the estate running as always. Among them was 19-year-old Sally Hemings. She was Martha's half-sister, the daughter of Martha's father and an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings. The family connection was an open secret no one spoke about. Sally's position in the house began to shift. Jefferson trusted her, relied on her, and soon her life would be pulled into his world in a way she could never escape. In 1784, Jefferson was appointed America's minister to France, taking over from Benjamin Franklin. He sailed across the Atlantic with his eldest daughter, Martha, and left the younger children behind. Paris changed everything for him. It was a city alive with ideas, freedom, equality, revolution. Jefferson attended salons filled with philosophers who dreamed of a better world, a world where every man was free. But even in those candlelit rooms, Jefferson never saw the contradiction. He spoke of liberty while owning human beings. He wrote about justice while calculating the value of the people who worked his fields. In 1787, he sent for his younger daughter, Polly, to join him in Paris. She was only 8 years old and needed someone trustworthy to accompany her. Jefferson chose Sally Hemings. Sally was 24 then, educated, fluent in French, and beautiful. It wasn't a random choice. Jefferson knew exactly what he was doing. Sally's bloodline made her family, and yet she was still his property. The voyage took 7 long weeks. The ship rolled endlessly through black water and storms, carrying both of them toward a city that would change their lives forever. When they arrived, Sally saw a world unlike anything she'd known, a world where people of color walked freely, where slavery was outlawed. In France, the moment she stepped onto French soil, Sally Hemings was legally free. She didn't have to serve anyone ever again. She could have walked away. Historians still argue about what happened next. Some say Jefferson explained the law to her. Others believe she learned it from the growing community of free Black Americans living in Paris. But everyone agrees on one fact. Sally Hemings became pregnant while in France. She was 16. Jefferson was 44. Whatever existed between them, it could never be called love, not in a world where one person owned the other. She had no legal right to say no. And, yet, somehow, she found a way to negotiate. Years later, her son Madison Hemings told what his mother had said about those days in Paris. Sally agreed to return to Virginia only if Jefferson promised that her children would one day be free. That was her only power, the threat to stay in France, to expose the truth in a place where slavery was forbidden. Did Jefferson really promise this? We'll never know for sure. But the bargain, real or imagined, became the foundation of everything that followed. In October 1789, Sally Hemings returned to America. She was pregnant with Jefferson's child. She returned to the same estate where she was born, but everything had changed. She was both servant and secret, mother and prisoner. At Monticello, Jefferson had built a hidden network of rooms and tunnels connecting the main house to the servants' quarters. Sally's new room was in the South Dependency, a small, dim chamber carved into the hillside. It connected to the main house through narrow passageways so she could move unseen. The room had one window. It faced away from the grand entrance, away from visitors' eyes. There was a bed, a chair, and a small table. By plantation standards, it was comfortable. But by human standards, it was a cage, a carefully built space for someone meant to be forgotten. The first child Sally bore Jefferson died soon after birth. There is no record of that baby in Jefferson's famous journals, where he documented every crop, every expense, every other enslaved child. The silence speaks volumes. Between 1795 and 1808, Sally Hemings gave birth to at least 6 more children. 4 survived: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. These children lived in a strange half-life. Everyone at Monticello knew who their father was. They were enslaved, yet privileged. They were educated, trained in trades, kept close to the main house, and light-skinned enough to blend into white society when freedom finally came. Visitors noticed. They whispered about the young servants who looked so much like Jefferson's legitimate children. One guest wrote that Harriet Hemings looked so much like Jefferson's daughter Martha that they could have been twins. Still, Jefferson said nothing. Not in letters, not in journals, not in conversation. He erased their existence from history with the same precision he used to erase his wife's letters. But secrets have a way of seeping through walls. Because even though Jefferson never acknowledged Sally Hemings or their children, their faces told the story he tried to bury. And deep inside Monticello, where the corridors twist beneath the marble floors, her shadow still lingers, a reminder that the man who wrote about freedom kept his own family in chains. To be continued in Part 3, The Children of Silence. Call to action. If this story shocked you, wait until you see what happened to Sally's children, how some escaped, how others vanished, and how one carried their secret into the heart of America's founding myths. Subscribe, share this video, and tell me where you're watching from. Because the ghosts of Monticello aren't done speaking yet. Title: The Hidden Room, Part 3, The President's Secret. Hook. What if the walls of Monticello could talk? What if the marble floors of America's most celebrated mansion whispered about the secret they were built to hide, a secret so dangerous that generations of presidents, historians, and families conspired to erase it? Tonight, we return to the hidden corridors of Thomas Jefferson's home, where one woman lived unseen, her story buried beneath centuries of lies. But the truth, like water through cracked stone, always finds a way out. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, especially if you're from Virginia. And make sure to subscribe. Because what happens next in this story of power, silence, and control will change the way you see American history forever. Part 3. The Hidden Room. For nearly 20 years, Sally Hemings lived in the shadows of Monticello. She didn't vanish through magic or escape, she disappeared because history refused to see her. Unlike the other enslaved workers who served guests or tended fires, Sally was invisible. She didn't serve meals, didn't greet visitors, and never appeared in the journals or letters of guests. She moved only when Jefferson was home. When he left for Washington or entertained political allies, she vanished into her small, hidden room beneath the house. This wasn't an accident, it was a design. Jefferson had built Monticello like a machine, a masterpiece of architecture that doubled as a stage for his life and a fortress for his secrets. Behind the elegant columns and polished wood were narrow staircases, secret tunnels, and service corridors that allowed enslaved people to appear and disappear without ever being seen. Food arrived at dinner as if by magic. Fires burned in the hearth, yet no servant was visible. Beds were made, wine poured, candles replaced, by hands that the guests never saw. This same system kept Sally Hemings out of sight. Her existence wasn't just hidden, it was architecturally erased. The walls themselves were designed to protect the man who claimed that all men are created equal. But secrets don't stay buried forever. In 1802, the silence cracked. James Callender, a bitter journalist and political enemy of Jefferson, published a scandal in the Richmond Recorder. He accused President Jefferson of keeping an enslaved mistress named Sally and fathering her children. To prove it, he mocked Jefferson in a cruel poem. Of all the damsels on the green, on mountain or in valley, alas so luscious ne'er was seen, as Monticellian Sally. It was crude, it was public, and it was true. The accusations caused a political storm. Jefferson's enemies celebrated, his supporters panicked. But Jefferson's allies quickly came to his defense. They called Callender a drunk, a liar, a man out for revenge. They said Sally's children were fathered not by Jefferson, but by his nephew, Peter Carr. And Jefferson himself, he said nothing, not a single word in his defense or in denial. He simply ignored the accusations. That silence was taken as dignity, as proof that the president was above such vile rumors. His family closed ranks. His daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, who lived at Monticello and certainly knew the truth, repeated the same lie for decades. It was the nephew, not the president. And just like that, the world looked away. Inside Monticello, life went on. Sally, about 40 years old when the scandal broke, remained in her hidden room. Her children were growing. Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, all were being educated, trained, and treated differently from the other enslaved workers. They were Jefferson's children, but the world was not allowed to know. Archaeologists have since found the remains of the South Dependency, the buried chambers where enslaved servants lived. Buttons, bits of pottery, fragments of glass, and medicine bottles tell us that life happened there quietly, in the spaces just beneath history. Sally's specific room was found decades later, just 12 feet wide, with a single window facing away from the main house. That small space connected directly to Jefferson's private quarters through a hidden passageway. It was both home and prison. Think about that for a moment. Jefferson, the philosopher of liberty, designed a mansion where freedom and slavery coexisted under one roof. Every invention he created, his hidden dumbwaiters, his secret staircases, had two meanings. They made his home elegant, and they made his shame invisible. That room was never meant to be remembered. As Jefferson aged, the contradictions of his life grew impossible to ignore. He served 2 terms as president, leading a young nation that celebrated equality while enslaving over 100 people. He retired to Monticello in 1809, an old man burdened with debt, still preaching freedom while counting human lives as property. By then, Sally was in her late 30s. Her children were almost grown. Beverly was training as a carpenter. Harriet was learning fine textile work. Madison and Eston, still boys, were being taught skills in reading, an education few enslaved children ever received. Jefferson's white grandchildren remembered this time differently. Some claimed they never saw Sally at all. Others admitted she existed but insisted she was just another servant. One granddaughter, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, became especially defensive years later, writing letters full of denial and outrage. She claimed that anyone saying Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings was spreading lies meant to stain the memory of a great man. But not everyone kept quiet. Israel Jefferson, another enslaved man who worked at Monticello, later testified that Sally's children were Jefferson's without a doubt. And decades later, in 1873, Madison Hemings, Sally's son, gave an interview describing his mother's story with quiet certainty. He said she had lived as Jefferson's mistress and that he had promised her freedom for her children. At the time, white historians dismissed these testimonies as fantasy. But modern DNA evidence confirmed what Sally's descendants had said all along: Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children. The most haunting part of this story isn't the relationship itself, it's the massive, organized effort to hide it. Jefferson's family lied. His political allies protected him. His community turned away. And later, historians, men who built their careers defending the purity of America's founders, deliberately erased Sally Hemings from the record. Because to acknowledge her meant admitting that the man who wrote the words, "All men are created equal," owned and impregnated the woman he enslaved. By 1822, the oldest of Sally's children, Beverly, quietly walked away from Monticello. He didn't run. He simply left, blending into white society. Jefferson's farm records marked him as "run," a cold word for a son's silent departure. 2 years later, Harriet followed. Jefferson gave her $50 and arranged her passage north. She vanished into freedom, into whiteness, into history's blind spot. After Jefferson's death in 1826, 2 more of Sally's sons, Madison and Eston, were officially freed in his will. The document didn't call them his children. It simply said they were released, in consequence of faithful service. As for Sally herself, she was never legally freed. Jefferson's will didn't mention her name. After his death, his daughter Martha quietly allowed her to leave Monticello. Sally spent her final years in Charlottesville, living with her sons. She died in 1835, around 62 years old. The white families of the town knew exactly who she was, but they stayed silent. The real horror of this story isn't just what happened to Sally Hemings. It's what happened to the truth. For more than a century and a half, America's historians, educators, and institutions worked together, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously, to erase her. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which manages Monticello today, spent decades denying the relationship. When the Hemings family spoke, they were ignored. When documents surfaced, they were dismissed. Even when DNA testing became possible, historians resisted, claiming it would be disrespectful to Jefferson's memory. For over 150 years, the hidden room under Monticello wasn't just a chamber of secrets, it was a monument to America's denial. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The whispers, the rumors, the silence, they were all cracks in the wall. And eventually, the truth came flooding through. To be continued in Part 4, The Bloodline of Freedom. Call to action. If this story moved you, share it. Comment where you're watching from. Because the next chapter uncovers what happened to Sally's children, the ones who carried both the blood of slavery and the legacy of freedom. And remember, the ghosts of Monticello are still speaking. Part 4, The Ghosts of Monticello. Have you ever felt that a house can remember? That walls can hold secrets long after the people are gone? Visitors say Monticello is one of those places. On misty mornings, when the fog drifts down from the Blue Ridge Mountains, the great house seems to breathe. The silence inside feels heavy, as if it knows the weight of what happened there. Guides speak softly. Footsteps echo too loud. Some say the house itself mourns. By the 1820s, Thomas Jefferson's beloved Monticello had become both a monument and a prison. The old man moved slowly through its halls, surrounded by debts, regrets, and the ghosts of choices he refused to face. His health was failing, but his mind never stopped building, planning, revising. He still tinkered with inventions, drew sketches for new designs, and spoke of liberty even as enslaved people passed silently through hidden corridors. Sally Hemings was still there, though she remained out of sight. Her presence was like a shadow that stretched across every polished floor. Those who worked at Monticello noticed things. Late at night, when most of the house was dark, a single lamp would glow in the south dependency. The servants whispered that Jefferson often visited that wing after everyone else had gone to bed. They pretended not to see him. They knew better than to ask questions. When he returned, he looked pale, tired, haunted. Outside, the plantation was crumbling. The soil had been stripped by years of tobacco. The enslaved families who lived on the mountain worked harder than ever, planting new crops to feed the household while Jefferson's finances fell apart. Letters from this time reveal a man who could not face the truth of his own creation. He wrote about liberty and virtue while counting human beings as assets to sell. He talked about the future of America while ignoring the people he held captive just below his feet. Sally Hemings' children were growing into adulthood now. Beverly and Harriet had already vanished into the free world. They had blended into white society, leaving behind the mountain that had kept them invisible. Madison and Eston, the youngest, were still at Monticello. Jefferson treated them differently, quietly preparing them for life beyond the plantation. They learned music, carpentry, reading, and arithmetic. The others noticed the difference and whispered that these children carried the master's blood. But Monticello had its own way of hiding the truth. Jefferson's granddaughters, who played in the halls, were told never to speak of the Hemings family. When guests visited, Sally stayed behind closed doors. Her footsteps were soft. Her voice was never heard in the grand rooms. The architecture itself made her vanish. Narrow hallways and secret stairs allowed her to move unseen. It was as if she were part of the house, a silent spirit living between its walls. In 1826, Jefferson's time ran out. On the morning of July 4, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the third President of the United States took his final breath. Outside, a thunderstorm rolled over the mountain. Inside, the great house grew still. The enslaved people waited in silence, unsure of what freedom his death might bring. They had heard promises before. Most would soon learn those promises meant nothing. After his death, Jefferson's debts were so large that everything he owned had to be sold. The furniture, the books, the paintings, and yes, the people. One by one, families were separated, children torn from parents, lives scattered across Virginia. The auction at Monticello was said to be one of the saddest in the state's history. Visitors came from miles away to see the estate of the great Jefferson dismantled piece by piece. But two names were missing from the sale, Madison and Eston Hemings. Jefferson's will freed them, though he never said why. He called it a reward for faithful service, a cold phrase that hid a lifetime of secrets. Sally Hemings herself was not freed, but Jefferson's daughter Martha allowed her to live as if she were. No papers, no ceremony, no acknowledgement. Just quiet release. Sally left Monticello that same year, moving to Charlottesville with her sons. She lived in a small brick house, tending her garden, avoiding attention. People in town knew who she was, but they did not speak of it. They treated her like a rumor, something better left unspoken. Some said she still carried herself like someone used to finer things. Others said she walked with her head down, as if trying to disappear again. In 1835, Sally Hemings died. No church bell rang. No obituary was written. Her grave was never marked. But those who lived near her said strange things began to happen at Monticello after that. Servants who worked the grounds claimed they saw a figure walking the paths at night, a woman in white, moving silently toward the south dependency. Her face was never clear, but her presence brought a cold wind even in summer. One night, a caretaker heard footsteps in the old cellar. He followed the sound and found nothing but the creak of wood and the rustle of mice. Yet when he looked toward Sally's old room, he swore he saw a candle flicker behind the sealed door. The next morning, when he returned, the air inside the room smelled faintly of lavender, the same scent Sally had once used. Over the years, the ghost stories multiplied. Visitors spoke of hearing soft humming in the corridors at night, the voice of a woman singing to a child. Some said they heard faint whispers when standing near Jefferson's old bedroom, as if two voices were locked in an endless conversation only they could hear. Others felt chills near the south dependency, especially near the narrow window where Sally's room once looked out on the hillside. Even the historians who restored Monticello in the 20th century reported strange sensations. Tools went missing and reappeared. Lights flickered in rooms with no electricity. A few swore they heard footsteps behind them when no one else was there. One researcher claimed that late at night, she saw a shadow move through the corridor connecting Jefferson's private chambers to the dependency. When she followed, the air turned icy, and she heard the faint sound of a heartbeat in the walls. Some say the haunting isn't supernatural at all. It's the weight of history itself, the echoes of lives erased and the truth buried beneath centuries of denial. Monticello stands today as both a shrine and a warning. The walls whisper not just about Jefferson's brilliance, but about the cost of his silence. Sally Hemings' spirit, whether real or imagined, refuses to fade because her story refuses to die. The house still stands. The corridors still twist and turn. And when night falls over the mountain, the great mansion seems to breathe again, remembering the woman who once lived unseen within its walls. Every light that flickers, every unexplained sound, every cold breeze that moves through Monticello might just be history itself reminding us, truth cannot stay buried forever. Would you like me to continue with part 5 in the same horror historical storytelling style, around 1,000 words? Part 5: The House That Wouldn't Sleep. There are nights when Monticello doesn't rest. The air grows thick and still. The moonlight turns the white columns silver. The mountain itself seems to hold its breath. Those who have spent the night there say that something begins to move after midnight. The creak of old floorboards, the faint rhythm of footsteps pacing above and below. Some say it is Thomas Jefferson still wandering his masterpiece, unable to let go of the home that was both his pride and his prison. But others whisper that it isn't Jefferson at all. They say it's her, the woman who lived unseen. The one who was never supposed to leave a trace. By the mid-1800s, Monticello had fallen into ruin. The Jefferson family had lost nearly everything after the great man's death. The furniture was gone, the books sold, the fields overgrown with weeds. Travelers who came to see the former president's home often found it eerie and abandoned. The shutters banged in the wind. The rooms echoed with emptiness. And yet, some visitors claimed they did not feel alone. One story comes from a traveler named Reverend Charles Givens. In 1852, he wrote about his visit to Monticello in a small Virginia journal. He described walking through the decaying halls with a local caretaker as his guide. The caretaker warned him that certain parts of the house were best avoided after dark. Givens laughed at the superstition and insisted on exploring anyway. When the two men entered the south dependency, the air changed. It felt colder there, damp. The smell of earth and age filled the narrow corridor. The caretaker refused to go farther. He said that sometimes he heard humming coming from the last room, the one that had no name on the floor plan. Givens called it nonsense and stepped inside alone. The air felt heavy, pressing against his chest. He saw nothing but shadows and dust, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Then he heard it, a soft sound like fabric brushing against stone. He turned. Nothing. Then, just before he left, a whisper reached his ear, faint but clear. It said, "You forgot me." He ran from the room and refused to enter it again. In his journal, he wrote, "Monticello sleeps, but it does not rest. The house breathes with sorrow." Over the years, people continued to report strange occurrences. Workers restoring the property in the early 1900s told stories of tools vanishing overnight and reappearing in locked rooms. Some heard the sound of a woman weeping softly from behind the walls. Others saw a pale figure standing at the far end of the south passage, her outline shimmering in the dark. They said she wore a white gown, her hair tied back, her face turned toward the window that once looked down the hill. Historians tried to explain these things away. They said it was drafts, old pipes, imagination. But even they couldn't deny that the south dependency felt different. It was the one part of the house that never seemed warm, even in summer. Visitors complained of feeling dizzy or uneasy there, as if the air itself carried a weight of memory. By the time the Thomas Jefferson Foundation took over Monticello in the early 20th century, the house had become a museum. Guides told stories of Jefferson's genius, his inventions, his writings. But they avoided mentioning Sally Hemings. Her name was left out of the official tours. The ghost, however, refused to stay quiet. Night guards who patrolled the grounds often heard movement in the south dependency. One guard reported seeing candlelight flicker through a sealed window. Another swore he heard someone walking up the hidden staircase leading to Jefferson's room. When he followed, there was no one there. In the 1960s, when archaeologists began excavating the buried sections of Monticello, they uncovered fragments of pottery, buttons, and beads near what they believed to be the servants' quarters. One night, a young student working on the dig claimed that her lantern kept blowing out for no reason. She lit it again and saw, for just a moment, the outline of a woman's hand pressed against the inside of a brick wall. She screamed, and when others came running, the handprint was gone, but the bricks where she had seen it were colder than ice. Locals began to avoid Monticello after dark. They said the mountain was cursed. That the sins buried there refused to sleep. Some swore that on the anniversary of Jefferson's death, you could hear two voices arguing softly in the halls, one calm, one full of sorrow. And sometimes, just before dawn, a woman's shadow would move across the eastern window, staring toward the horizon where freedom had once been only a ship away. It wasn't until 1998 that science finally confirmed what the whispers had said for 2 centuries. DNA evidence proved that Thomas Jefferson had indeed fathered Sally Hemings' children. The truth that had been denied, hidden, and rewritten for generations was finally undeniable. The world called it revelation. But for those who believed in ghosts, it felt like justice. As if the house itself had been waiting for the truth to be spoken before it could breathe again. After the results were announced, the staff at Monticello noticed something strange. The nighttime disturbances grew quieter. The cold spots less intense. The whispers faded. It was as if the spirit that had haunted the South dependency for nearly 200 years was finally at peace. But peace at Monticello is never complete. Visitors still report glimpses of movement in that old hidden corridor. A faint scent of lavender. The sound of a woman's soft voice humming a tune no one can identify. Maybe it's the echo of memory. Maybe it's the wind through the old brick walls. Or maybe it's Sally Hemings herself, making sure we never forget. Because Monticello isn't just a house. It's a story carved in wood and stone, a reminder that even the greatest names in history can carry the darkest secrets. The mansion stands tall on its mountain, beautiful and broken, haunted by the silence of those who were never allowed to speak. And sometimes, when the moonlight touches its windows just right, it looks almost alive, like it's still waiting for someone to finally tell the whole truth. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, the next chapter of this haunting historical series, in the same cinematic and eerie storytelling style? Part 6: The Shadows Beneath the Mountain. Monticello stands proud above the rolling hills of Virginia, a symbol of reason and beauty. Tourists climb the mountain every year, smiling for photos, walking the paths where history was written. They marvel at Jefferson's inventions, the revolving doors, the secret wine lifts, the grand dome that glows in sunlight. But few realize that beneath the polished surface lies something much darker. Beneath the foundations, beyond the reach of the tour guides, the mountain still hides its secrets. And on some nights, those secrets whisper. It began again one summer in 2003. A small group of researchers stayed late after closing, cataloging artifacts in the cellar beneath the south dependency. The air was damp, the lights dim. Around midnight, one of them, a historian named Caroline West, heard a faint sound. It was rhythmic, like breathing or quiet humming. She assumed it was the wind and kept working. But when she turned toward the far end of the corridor, she saw a flicker of light, like a candle flame where no light should have been. Caroline walked toward it. The glow retreated deeper into the shadows. She reached the final chamber and felt a rush of cold air, though the night outside was warm. On the wall, her flashlight caught a set of initials scratched faintly into the plaster, SH. She felt her stomach tighten. The markings were old, barely visible. But the second she touched them, she heard a voice behind her. It was soft, almost kind. "Do you remember me?" Caroline turned around. The light was gone. The corridor stood silent, but from that night on, she swore the mountain was watching her. Monticello had always been a living monument, but the more scholars uncovered about Sally Hemings, the more the house itself seemed to react. Lights flickered in rooms with no power problems. Visitors reported cold spots where none existed before. Security cameras caught shapes moving across empty halls. It was as though, after centuries of silence, the mountain had begun to speak in its own way. Some staff members started calling it the breathing house. One evening, a young intern noticed a faint mist rolling out from the floorboards of Jefferson's study. It looked almost like fog, curling and shifting. Then she saw something inside the haze, a woman's outline, standing near the alcove bed Jefferson had designed for himself. The figure turned her head, and for a moment, her eyes met the girl's. They were calm, sad, and knowing. Then the mist folded in on itself and vanished. News of the haunting spread quietly among the Foundation staff. Few spoke of it publicly, fearing ridicule. But the older caretakers, the ones who had lived in the area their whole lives, weren't surprised. They said the spirits of the mountain were restless because the story still wasn't finished. The world had acknowledged the truth, but it hadn't made peace with it. Jefferson's statue still stood in marble halls. His words still defined liberty for millions. But the woman who shared his home, his blood, and his silence remained half forgotten. Around 2017, the Foundation began planning a new exhibit. For the first time, they would tell Sally Hemings' story openly. They would reconstruct her room and display it to visitors. It was a bold step, one that caused arguments among scholars and politicians. Some said it tarnished Jefferson's legacy. Others said it was long overdue. But when construction began in the South Dependency, strange things started to happen. Workers complained that their tools kept going missing, only to be found neatly arranged at the base of the wall believed to have been Sally's. A carpenter said that every time he entered the room, his radio stopped working. One day, a mason found a single pearl button buried in the dirt beneath the floorboards. When he touched it, the temperature in the room dropped instantly. He placed the button on a table and left for lunch. When he returned, it was gone. The night before the exhibit opened, the lights in the South Dependency flickered out completely. The security team checked the power system but found no faults. When the lights came back on, the curators noticed something new, a faint outline on the wall above the reconstructed bed. It looked like the imprint of a hand, the fingers long and delicate. The mark stayed for several days before fading away. On opening day, the first visitors entered the exhibit quietly. The room was small, simply furnished. A narrow bed, a wooden table, a single window facing the hillside. Nothing about it seemed unusual, yet people walked out in tears. Some said they felt sorrow pressing against their chests. Others said they smelled lavender, faint and fleeting, though no flowers were nearby. A few reported hearing music, soft humming, as if a woman were trying to calm herself in the dark. That night, one of the docents stayed behind after closing. She wanted to leave flowers on the table in Sally's room. When she stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like the mountain itself was breathing around her. She placed the flowers and whispered, "You're remembered now." Then she turned to leave. Behind her, a voice whispered back, finally. In the months that followed, Monticello became more than a museum. It became a reckoning. Scholars from around the world came to study the intersection of memory and denial. Tourists walked through the halls with a new kind of reverence, seeing not just Jefferson's brilliance but also his shadow. And still, on quiet nights, the house seemed to hum. Some say the energy that lingers there isn't malevolent. It's sorrowful but peaceful, as though the mountain has accepted the truth at last. Others insist there's still something unfinished. They speak of another room, deeper underground, one that no map shows and no tour explores. A place where the earliest workers whispered of hidden tunnels, of walls that seem to move when no one is watching. Old blueprints hint at strange anomalies beneath the foundation. Sealed spaces, unexplained gaps. One researcher claimed to have found evidence of a hidden vault carved directly into the bedrock. He believed Jefferson had designed it himself, a chamber meant to store personal artifacts and letters. But excavation was never approved. The foundation feared damaging the house. The rumor persists that the chamber still exists and that whatever lies inside holds the final chapter of Monticello's secret. Some nights, hikers who wander too close to the mountain after dark report hearing faint music drifting down the slope. It isn't loud or distinct, just a few notes, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Locals say that's Sally's song. That the mountain hums because it remembers. Monticello remains one of the most visited historic homes in America, but after sunset, few stay long. The air turns cold, and the silence grows deep. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaks, as though someone is still walking those corridors that once hid so much pain. The mountain may be at peace, but peace and silence are not the same thing. The story of Monticello isn't finished yet. The walls still hold breath. The mountain still keeps its watch. And somewhere beneath the stone and memory, a truth waits, something darker, older, and far more human than any legend ever told. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, where we explore what lies hidden beneath Monticello and how the final secrets of the mountain begin to surface? Part 7: The Chamber of Silence. For decades, no one dared to disturb the earth beneath Monticello. The house was sacred ground, both to history and to memory. Yet in 2021, a quiet excavation began at the base of the mountain. The Jefferson Foundation had approved a limited archaeological survey to study the original structure's drainage systems. Officially, it was a scientific project. Unofficially, some believed it was an attempt to locate the hidden vault rumored to exist beneath the main foundation. The excavation began on a misty morning in May. The crew set up tents and scaffolds beside the South Pavilion, working under the supervision of Dr. Nathaniel Carr, an expert in early American architecture. Carr was a careful man, logical to the core. He believed in facts, not folklore. But as the digging progressed, he noticed strange patterns in the soil. Sections of earth felt unnaturally compacted, as if deliberately filled long ago. Beneath one of these areas, his team found a layer of dark clay unlike anything else on the site. They dug deeper and uncovered something unexpected, a flat slab of limestone, perfectly cut and placed with precision. Beneath it, a hollow space resonated faintly when struck. Carr ordered the team to stop and brought in ground-penetrating radar. The images showed a rectangular chamber roughly 10 feet below the slab. The shape was too regular to be natural. Carr's pulse quickened. Permission to continue came 2 days later. The slab was lifted carefully, revealing a narrow staircase carved directly into the rock. The steps descended into darkness, slick with moisture and centuries of silence. The air that rose from below was cold and heavy, smelling faintly of iron and old wood. Carr shone his flashlight into the opening, but the beam seemed to vanish into the black. Only 3 people went down that first night: Carr, his assistant, and a security officer named Miguel. The passage twisted slightly before opening into a small stone chamber. The walls were smooth and bare, except for faint tool marks. At the center of the room sat a chest made of oak, its surface blackened by time. Metal hinges clung to it like veins of rust. No locks, no seals. Just the box and the silence. Carr knelt beside it. The chest was covered in a thin layer of dust. When he brushed it away, he noticed symbols etched faintly into the wood, interlocking circles, an old Masonic emblem. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. The hinges creaked softly. Inside were several objects. A leather-bound book, a small glass vial sealed with wax, and a folded piece of parchment. He opened the book first. It contained Jefferson's handwriting, but these weren't political notes or architectural sketches. The entries were personal, fragmented, and unsettling. He wrote of dreams that felt too vivid to ignore, of voices whispering beneath the house, of shapes seen moving through the walls. One line caught Carr's attention. The mountain breathes with the souls of those buried within her shadow. Carr set the book aside, unnerved. He picked up the parchment next. It was brittle with age but legible. It appeared to be a confession written in Jefferson's hand, addressed to no one. In it, he spoke of a hidden experiment, a chamber he designed not for preservation but for isolation. He called it, the Chamber of Silence. According to the letter, he believed certain frequencies of sound and vibration could preserve memory itself. He wanted to see if human emotion could be imprinted into matter. At the bottom of the letter was a single cryptic warning: if ever this chamber is opened before the mountain is at peace, the silence will return to claim its due. Carr stared at the words, unsure what to make of them. Miguel, standing behind him, whispered that they should leave. But before Carr could respond, the glass vial rolled slightly inside the chest and cracked against the wood. A faint mist escaped, spreading slowly through the chamber. The air turned colder, and the flashlight began to flicker. Carr felt pressure in his ears, like standing too close to a deep vibration. A low hum filled the air, soft but powerful, resonating through the stone walls. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. A woman's voice, calm and sorrowful, speaking from within the walls. He tried to silence the truth, it said. But the truth remembers. The assistant screamed and bolted for the stairs. Miguel tried to follow, but the passage seemed to ripple like heat. Carr stood frozen. The mist coiled around him, forming vague shapes, a figure of a woman, her face blurred by smoke. She looked directly at him and whispered, "You brought it back." Then everything went dark. Carr woke up hours later at the base of the staircase. The chest was gone. The chamber was empty. Miguel and the assistant were both found unconscious near the surface, disoriented but alive. They had no memory of what happened after the mist appeared. The excavation site was shut down immediately. Official reports claimed a structural collapse and toxic gas exposure. The Chamber of Silence was sealed again. But that night, something changed in the house above. Security cameras recorded movement in Jefferson's study long after closing. The chair at his desk rocked gently, though no wind stirred. The lights in the south dependency flickered again, brighter than before, then burned out entirely. Visitors in the following weeks began to complain of nausea and headaches near certain parts of the house. Some claimed to hear humming through the floors, like the echo of a faraway song. Carr left Monticello soon after, but he couldn't forget what he'd seen. The handwriting, the symbols, the voice. He returned months later under a false name, pretending to be a tourist. He walked through the halls, listening carefully. When he reached the spot directly above the sealed chamber, he stopped. The air was colder there. And faintly, beneath the noise of the other visitors, he heard breathing. He tried to tell the Foundation what he'd discovered, but they refused to acknowledge the chamber's existence. They said no records confirmed it, no documentation, no blueprints. The slab he'd uncovered had been reburied and covered with stone. But Carr wasn't convinced. He began to write his findings in secret. In one of his final notes, he wrote, "The silence beneath Monticello isn't absence. It's memory, compressed until it can no longer sleep." A year later, Carr disappeared. His apartment was found empty, his research notes missing. The only thing left on his desk was a piece of parchment identical to the one he'd found in the chamber. On it was written a single line in Jefferson's own script: "To disturb the silence is to awaken what was meant to rest." Monticello remains open to visitors. The tour guides speak of history, architecture, and legacy. They never mention the Chamber of Silence. But sometimes, when the night air is still and the fog drapes the mountain, locals say the earth hums again, low and mournful. They say the silence beneath the stone is stirring once more. Would you like me to continue with part 8, where the haunting expands beyond Monticello and begins to affect those connected to its secrets. Part 8: The Haunting of Monticello. The silence beneath Monticello had not gone back to sleep. After Dr. Nathaniel Carr vanished, the house seemed to breathe differently. Visitors described an unease that clung to them long after leaving. The guides called it imagination, a trick of suggestion. But locals knew better. They said Monticello had finally started remembering. It began with sound, subtle at first. Late at night, the security staff heard faint footsteps in empty corridors. Motion sensors went off in sealed rooms. The sound of sweeping, the clink of porcelain, the quiet hum of a woman's song echoed through Jefferson's quarters even when no one was there. The staff called it the night shift whisperer. It became a running joke until one guard refused to come back after seeing a candle flicker to life by itself in the South Dependency. That guard, a woman named Leah Moore, reported hearing a voice behind her as she locked up one evening. It was soft and calm, with a trace of sorrow. "You should not have opened it," the voice said. Leah turned and saw no one. But when she looked in the glass display case beside Jefferson's writing desk, she saw a reflection that didn't belong to her, a woman. In a pale gown, eyes dark and endless, standing behind her shoulder. After that, Leah quit without collecting her last paycheck. She moved away, refusing to speak about what she'd seen. But before she left, she told a coworker that the reflection had whispered one more thing before fading. "He built the silence to hide me," it said. The Jefferson Foundation tried to bury the stories. They blamed stress, fatigue, and old wiring for the strange noises. They changed the security shifts, added new lighting, and reinstalled cameras. But the disturbances continued. Footage showed chairs moving, objects sliding across tables, doors closing gently when no one was near. In one recording, a faint silhouette appeared at the end of the hallway and then vanished when the lights flickered. The timestamp read 3:03 a.m. Around the same time, a group of university researchers arrived to conduct a study on sound resonance in historical buildings. The lead researcher, Drive, Aisha Coleman, had read fragments of Carr's unpublished notes. She believed Jefferson's Chamber of Silence was not just myth but an early attempt at acoustic preservation. She wanted to find out if it still existed, and what it contained. Her team set up sensitive recording equipment throughout Monticello. They used laser microphones and thermal sensors to detect vibrations through the structure. On the third night, their instruments picked up a strange frequency coming from beneath the South Dependency. It was not mechanical, not random. It pulsed in intervals, 5 beats, then 3, then 2, like a coded rhythm. When they isolated the sound, it resembled a woman's breath, followed by faint whispering. The words were hard to make out, but when they slowed the playback, they heard a phrase clearly. "Tell them I am still here." The team was shaken. The next morning, Coleman presented the data to the Foundation's director, but he dismissed it. He ordered her to stop the experiments immediately, claiming they might disturb the site's integrity. That night, Coleman ignored the order. She and her 2 assistants returned with handheld recorders and a digital camera. They entered the basement area beneath the South Pavilion around midnight. The air was dense and cool, the smell of damp stone heavy around them. As they advanced, their flashlights began to dim. Coleman noticed the walls sweating with moisture even though it hadn't rained for days. One of the assistants pointed out faint handprints smeared across the bricks, small and uneven, as if left by someone trying to climb out. They reached the sealed slab Carr had uncovered years before. Someone had restored it, covering it with new concrete, but there was still a thin crack running along one edge. Coleman placed a small recording microphone into the gap. The sound it captured froze them all in place. It was music, a soft lullaby, sung in a trembling voice, drifting up from the darkness. The melody was unfamiliar yet strangely tender. Coleman began recording, tears in her eyes. "She's still here," she whispered. The air grew colder, and her breath came out as mist. Then the song stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so close it felt like someone was speaking directly into her ear. "Do not let them silence me again," one of the assistants screamed. The recorder fell and shattered. The concrete beneath them trembled, and a crack split across the floor. Coleman grabbed her team and fled, tripping over debris as the lights flickered wildly. Behind them, something shifted inside the wall, like the slow movement of stone grinding against stone. They made it outside, shaking and pale. The foundation shut down the area permanently, citing safety concerns. Coleman's data was confiscated, and her university quietly withdrew its support. Within a month, she too disappeared, leaving behind only her field journal. The final entry read, "The silence is a prison built for truth. Every whisper is trying to escape." After that, Monticello's atmosphere changed. Tourists began complaining about oppressive feelings during tours. Some fainted near the South Dependency. Cameras malfunctioned near Jefferson's bedroom. Photos taken by visitors occasionally showed strange shadows, figures where no one had been standing. A paranormal investigation group arrived one October night, streaming live for millions online. They mocked the legends, laughing as they wandered the dark hallways. But as they entered Jefferson's private study, their laughter stopped. The room temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Their equipment began to fail one by one. The leader of the group asked, jokingly, "Is there anyone here who wants to speak?" The reply came instantly. A woman's voice filled every speaker, clear and resonant. "I waited long enough." The stream went black. The video disappeared from their channel within hours. The team refused interviews, claiming technical failure. But an unedited recording leaked a week later. In the final frame, just before the feed cut off, the faint outline of a woman could be seen standing beside Jefferson's desk, her hand resting on the chair. Her eyes were hollow, but her expression was calm, almost sad. The foundation tried to suppress the footage, but the damage was done. Monticello became infamous overnight. Visitors flocked to see the haunted house of the founding father. The guides, instructed to stick to history, often avoided the South Dependency altogether. Yet every so often, a curious tourist would linger there alone, listening closely. Some swore they could hear breathing from behind the wall. By late winter, new cracks appeared in the foundation, small at first, but growing. The engineers said it was normal settlement. But the locals whispered that the house was trying to open itself. They said the woman beneath it had waited too long to be forgotten again. And every night, when the last light went out, the mountain itself seemed to hum, a low and steady sound like someone sighing through stone. It was no longer silence. It was the beginning of awakening. Would you like me to continue with part 9, where the haunting spreads beyond Monticello and begins reaching into the lives of those who've tried to hide the truth? Part 9: The Unraveling. By the spring that followed, Monticello was no longer just a tourist site. It had become a magnet for darkness. Every journalist, historian, and thrill-seeker wanted to see where America's buried truth had begun whispering again. But those who came too close found that the house didn't let go easily. It watched, it remembered, it followed. The haunting began to stretch beyond its walls. People who had worked there, even those who had left years earlier, started reporting strange phenomena. One of the groundskeepers, an old man named Robert Hayes, called a local radio show claiming that every night at 3 in the morning, he heard a woman crying outside his farmhouse window. He lived 20 miles away, but the sound came from just beyond his yard. He said he recognized the voice from Monticello's corridors, soft and trembling, like someone praying. 3 nights after that call, Hayes vanished. His truck was found parked in his driveway, the keys still in the ignition. The ground beneath his window was soaked, as though with rain, but it hadn't rained that night. Inside his house, investigators found a small patch of red clay smeared across the floor, soil identical to the kind found only on the Monticello hillside. The story hit the news, and suddenly Monticello's silence turned into a storm. The Jefferson Foundation was desperate to calm the panic. They called in experts, priests, even a psychologist who specialized in mass hysteria. But the strange events didn't stop. Visitors claimed to feel watched. Some described hearing whispers that seemed to know their names. One historian fainted while lecturing about Jefferson's ideals of freedom. When she regained consciousness, she said she'd felt someone's hand on her shoulder and heard a voice whisper, "Do you know my name?" The voice's presence spread like a rumor through the air. It didn't need proof. It needed belief. And once people began believing, things began happening faster. In June, a filmmaker named Marcus Lee decided to make a documentary about the haunting. He wanted to expose what he called the ghost of America's hypocrisy. He got permission to stay overnight inside Monticello, setting up cameras in every room. His plan was to record for 1 week straight, alone in the mansion. On the second night, his livestream went viral when viewers noticed movement in the background, just a flicker at first, a blur crossing behind him as he filmed Jefferson's study. Marcus didn't see it, but the chat exploded. They told him to turn around. When he did, the old fireplace had started smoking on its own. The air grew dense. Marcus stepped closer, coughing as soot fell from the chimney. The smoke took shape, a figure standing within it, head bowed, hands clasped in front. A woman's form, solid for a moment, then dissolving like fog. The camera kept rolling as Marcus dropped his equipment and backed away. His voice trembled. "Sally," he whispered, as if he already knew. The smoke responded with a low sigh, and then the feed cut out. When authorities entered the next morning, they found his cameras still recording but no sign of Marcus. The last frame of footage showed the south dependency door slightly ajar, swinging gently back and forth, as if someone had just walked through. The foundation tried to close the house indefinitely after that, but they were too late. The haunting had escaped its boundaries. Reporters who had covered the story began hearing strange sounds through their recordings, faint weeping, breathing, the click of Jefferson's quill scratching on invisible parchment. A historian in Boston woke to find one of Jefferson's quotes written across her bathroom mirror in condensation. "All men are created equal." Below it, another line had been added, written in trembling script. But not remembered the same. By late summer, Monticello's reputation shifted from haunted house to cursed landmark. Locals refused to drive near it after dark. Tourists reported seeing lights moving through the trees, as if candles were being carried along the old slave paths. Meanwhile, the Jefferson Foundation's archives started to fall apart. Hard drives failed, digital records corrupted, physical papers crumbled faster than they should have, as if time itself had turned against them. One archivist, desperate to save the documents, began photographing everything. Late one night, while reviewing the images, she noticed something impossible. In the background of almost every photograph, faint reflections appeared on the glass cases, faces watching her work. In one photo, the reflection was clear enough to make out the eyes. They were sad, knowing, and terribly human. Beneath that reflection, in the case labeled, "Personal Effects of Thomas Jefferson," she noticed something new. A smudge of fingerprints pressed against the inside of the glass. No one could explain how they got there. At first, people assumed it was moisture or dust. But when experts examined it, they found the prints belonged to a woman. Not a modern visitor, but a genetic match to descendants of the Hemings family. It was as if the past itself had reached forward to press its hand against the truth. That discovery changed everything. The foundation called a press conference to finally acknowledge what generations had denied, that the stories were true, that Jefferson had enslaved Sally Hemings and fathered her children. Cameras flashed, voices trembled, and somewhere beneath the ground, the house shivered again. That night, the electricity in Monticello went out. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the halls in red. One security guard swore he saw someone walking through Jefferson's study, holding a candle. He followed the figure through the corridors until it stopped before the sealed south dependency wall. The figure turned. It was the woman again, tall, calm, her dress pale in the red light. Her lips moved, forming words that filled the air without sound. The guard couldn't hear them, but he understood. He felt guilt, not his own but inherited, deep and ancient. When he blinked, she was gone, and the air around him smelled faintly of smoke and saltwater. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. A crack appeared in the plaster above Jefferson's bed. It widened through the day, spilling a fine red dust across the floor. When restoration workers chipped at it, they discovered a hidden chamber behind the wall, a narrow passage leading downward. At its end lay a small stone room, long sealed. Inside, archaeologists found fragments of furniture, scraps of muslin fabric, a small wooden comb, and a piece of parchment so decayed it was barely legible. The faint writing that remained read, "She lived unseen, but not unheard." No one could determine who had written it. The haunting of Monticello had moved beyond ghost stories. It had become revelation. Every secret Jefferson buried was now turning to dust in the open air. The silence he built, the corridors of concealment, the locked rooms, all of it was coming undone. By autumn, people said they could hear singing again at night. Not mournful this time, but steady and strong, echoing through the hills. It was the sound of something breaking free, the hum of truth rising after centuries of being buried. The story was no longer about Jefferson. It was about the voice he had tried to hide. The voice of Sally Hemings, carried by wind and stone, whispering the same words to anyone who would listen. Remember me. Would you like me to continue with Part 10, where the haunting finally forces the world to confront its ghosts, and Monticello itself begins to crumble under the weight of its buried sins? Part 10: The Ashes of Hollow Creek. Historic and horror story 1000 words. The morning after the fire, a cold mist covered the ruins of Hollow Creek. The old courthouse was gone, the church was a skeleton of stone, and the air smelled of wet ash and iron. Only the river still moved, whispering as if it had seen everything and wanted to keep the secret to itself. Eleanor stood at the edge of what had once been the town square, her boots sinking into the charred earth. The bell from the church lay cracked in the mud, its mouth filled with soot and rainwater. Around her were the remains of lives that had burned in a single night. She had no tears left to shed. What had once been her fear had turned into a strange, heavy calm. Some said it was the curse. Others said it was vengeance. But Eleanor knew it was both. The truth had been buried in the soil long before the fire ever started. The men who had built Hollow Creek had made a pact with darkness, and now they had paid the price. The sheriff found her hours later, staring into the smoke. His face was blackened, his coat torn, his badge twisted by heat. He did not speak at first. He simply removed his hat and looked at her, his eyes hollow. "Is it over?" he asked. She turned to him. "Nothing that begins in blood ever ends," she said. "It just waits for another soul to call it back." He wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words would not come. The sky began to clear, and light fell on the ruins like a ghostly hand. Together they walked toward the remains of the church. The stones were still warm, but beneath them something shimmered faintly. It was the iron door to the crypt, now half melted and open. They could smell the earth below, and something else, something sweet and rotten. Eleanor knelt and peered into the darkness. Inside lay the coffins of the founders, blackened and broken. Among them was a single book, its cover scorched but still intact. The sheriff hesitated. "Leave it," he whispered. But Eleanor shook her head. "This is what they sold their souls for," she said. "This is where it began." She reached in and pulled the book from the ashes. It was bound in leather and marked with strange symbols that seemed to shift when the light touched them. As she opened it, the pages trembled as if alive. The ink inside was red, not the brown of age, but the deep red of something freshly spilled. The sheriff stepped back. "That's not a book," he said. "That's a door." Eleanor looked up at him. "Then it's time someone closed it." That night, while the town buried its dead, Eleanor sat alone by the river. She read from the book, her voice low and steady. The words were written in a tongue older than English, older than the town itself. Each phrase seemed to stir the wind and make the trees shudder. The water darkened as she spoke, and shadows began to gather on its surface. From across the river came the sound of footsteps. At first she thought it was an echo, but then she saw them, figures moving through the fog, pale and silent. The founders. The men who had built Hollow Creek with blood and greed. Their faces were half burned, their eyes hollow, their mouths open as if still screaming from the fire. They stopped at the riverbank, watching her. The leader, Judge Pelham, raised a charred hand. "You cannot undo what was promised," he rasped. "The debt must be paid." Eleanor closed the book. "Then let it be paid in full," she said. She cast the book into the river. The moment it touched the water, the ground trembled. The current turned black, and a roar filled the night. The figures screamed, their shapes twisting and dissolving into mist. The sky split open with light, and for a heartbeat the entire valley glowed red. When it was over, the book was gone, and so were the ghosts. The river returned to its calm, but the air was forever changed. Days passed. The survivors began to rebuild what they could. But no one spoke of the fire. No one mentioned the names of the men who had died. The sheriff left town soon after, and some said he was never seen again. Eleanor remained. She built a small cabin on the edge of the forest and lived quietly, tending to the graves and writing what she remembered. She never spoke of the book, but sometimes, on nights when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, she would hear the river whispering her name. Years later, travelers passing through Hollow Creek would find the ruins still standing, untouched by time. They said the soil there never grew grass, and the air always smelled faintly of smoke. Some claimed they saw a woman in white walking by the river at dawn, her face hidden, her voice soft as wind. They said she was the keeper of Hollow Creek, the last witness of its curse. And when the moon was full, and the mist hung low, they swore they could hear the faint ringing of a cracked bell. Eleanor's journal was found decades later, buried beneath her cabin floor. The final entry was written, in trembling ink. "Evil never dies," it read. "It only sleeps. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it breathing beneath the earth." The historian who found the journal never finished reading it. He vanished a week later, leaving only his lantern beside the old riverbank. The light inside it still burned, though no one knew how. And so, the story of Hollow Creek faded into legend. But the land remembers. Every year, when the river floods, it washes up something strange, an old button, a coin, a torn page that smells faintly of fire. The people who live nearby do not touch them. They let the river take them back. For in Hollow Creek, the past is not buried. It waits, patient and hungry, beneath the ashes. And when the wind rises from the west, it carries a whisper through the trees. It says, "We are still here." If this tale of Hollow Creek sent a chill through your soul, don't let the story end here. Candle subscribe for more haunting journeys through forgotten towns and cursed histories. Skull share this story with those who dare to read by candlelight. I comment below, what do you think truly happened at Hollow Creek? Do you believe evil can ever be buried? Your voice keeps these stories alive, and the shadows listening.